Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished loading the last of the feed bags into his truck. The sun was setting over New Haven Colony, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him why he had chosen this quiet farming life 12 years ago. His small farm sat on the very edge of human territory, where the grasslands met the dark forest that stretched toward the Ironwood Mountains. The sound of heavy footsteps made him turn around. At first, Jake thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. Standing at the edge of his property, just beyond the energy fence that kept the local wildlife away from his livestock, was a dragon dot, not just any dragon, but a massive bronze-scaled creature that stood nearly 15 feet tall at the shoulder. Her powerful wings were folded against her back, and her long neck curved gracefully as she studied him with intelligent amber eyes. Jake had seen dragons before, but always from a distance, flying high above the colony or perched on distant mountain peaks. Never had one come this close to human settlement. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the plasma rifle hanging on his belt. Every colonist carried one, and for good reason. The frontier was full of dangerous creatures, though dragons were usually smart enough to avoid human territory. They were known throughout the galaxy as proud, territorial beings who considered most other species beneath their notice. The dragon spoke, her voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "Human farmer, I have watched your livestock practices. You waste much meat. I request only your discarded portions, the pork you humans cannot consume." Jake's mouth fell open. Dragons were legendary across the galaxy for their intelligence and their pride. They hoarded precious metals and gems, commanded respect from every species they encountered, and were feared as apex predators. Yet here was one asking him for scraps like a common scavenger. I can give you the leftover cuts from yesterday's slaughter," Jake managed to say, his voice barely steady. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure the dragon could hear it. "But why would you need our scraps? Dragons are apex predators?" The dragon's expression grew guarded, her amber eyes narrowing slightly. "That is not your concern, human. Will you provide the meat or not?" Jake studied the massive creature before him. Something was wrong. Her bronze scales, which should have gleamed like polished metal, were dull in places. Her massive frame seemed thinner than it should be for such a proud creature. There were small scars along her neck and shoulders that spoke of recent battles or struggles. "Wait here," Jake said, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. He walked to the processing shed behind his farmhouse, where he kept the cuts of meat his family couldn't use. Yesterday he had butchered one of his pigs, and there were several pounds of fatty portions and bones that he usually threw away or composted. When he returned with the meat wrapped in clean cloth, the dragon was still waiting exactly where he had left her. She accepted the bundle with careful dignity, her massive claws handling the package with surprising gentleness. "My name is Jake Morrison," he offered as she prepared to leave. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to introduce himself, but something about this encounter felt important. The dragon paused, her great head turning back toward him. "I am Kalen of the Crimson Ridge clan." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Your kindness will be remembered." With that, she turned and walked back toward the forest, her massive form disappearing into the trees with surprising grace. Jake stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had vanished, trying to process what had just happened. Over the next few days, Jake found himself thinking about the encounter constantly. He mentioned it to his wife Lisa when she called from the colony medical center where she worked, but she seemed more worried about his safety than curious about the dragon's strange behavior. "Maybe you should report it to the colonial authorities," she suggested. "Dragons don't usually approach human settlements." But Jake felt oddly protective of the secret. There had been something in Callan's manner, a dignity mixed with desperation, that made him want to help rather than report her to officials who might see her as a threat. 3 days later, she returned. This time Jake was ready, having saved the unusable portions from another pig he had processed. Kaylin accepted the meat with the same careful dignity, but Jake noticed she looked even thinner than before. "Are you sick?" he asked before he could stop himself. Kellen's amber eyes flashed with what might have been anger or embarrassment. "Dragons do not get sick, human. We are not weak like your kind." But even as she said it, Jake could see the lie in her posture. Her wings drooped slightly, and there was a tremor in her massive legs that spoke of exhaustion or pain. Still, her pride was clearly too great to admit any weakness to a human. The visits became regular. Every few days, Kalen would appear at his fence line, always polite but distant, always asking only for the leftover meat Jake couldn't use. She never took more than was offered, never demanded anything, and always thanked him with formal courtesy. Before disappearing back into the forest, Jake began to look forward to these visits. He started processing his livestock more carefully, making sure there were always good portions to offer her. He even began buying extra meat from other farmers in the colony, telling them he was experimenting with new preservation techniques, but with each visit, Kalen looked worse. Her scales grew duller, her frame thinner, and Jake began to notice small details that worried him. Sometimes she would pause while walking, as if catching her breath. Her once proud posture had developed a slight slouch, and her amber eyes, while still intelligent, seemed to hold a sadness that grew deeper each time he saw her. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the colony, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He had been watching Kellen's condition deteriorate for weeks, and his scientist's mind couldn't let go of the mystery. Before settling on New Haven, he had been a xenobiologist for the Terran Research Institute. He understood alien physiology, and everything he was seeing told him that Kalen was not just hungry, she was dying. Dragons were known to be solitary creatures, but Jake had begun to suspect that Kellen's situation might be more complex than that. Her formal manner, her careful dignity, and most importantly, her desperate need for food scraps suggested something far more serious than simple hunger. When she appeared the next evening, Jake was ready with his usual offering of meat. But this time, as she prepared to leave, he made a decision that would lead him deep into dragon territory and reveal a truth that would shake the foundations of everything the galaxy thought it knew about dragons. "Kalen," he called out as she reached the edge of the forest. "Whatever is happening to you, whatever is wrong, I want you to know that you're not alone. If you need help, real help, I'm here." The dragon paused, her great head turning back toward him. For a moment, her careful mask of dignity slipped, and Jake saw something in her amber eyes that made his heart ache. It was hope, fragile and desperate, mixed with a fear so deep it seemed to echo through her entire being. "Your kindness honors you, Jake Morrison," she said quietly. "But there are some burdens too heavy for humans to bear." With that, she vanished into the darkness, leaving Jake standing at his fence line with a growing certainty that he was about to do something very dangerous and very necessary. Jake Morrison spent the next 3 weeks watching Kalen grow weaker with each visit. The proud Dragoness still maintained her formal dignity, but her condition was getting worse. Her bronze scales had lost almost all their shine, and her massive frame seemed to shrink a little more each time she appeared at his fence line. Jake had been keeping detailed notes about her condition, old habits from his days as a xenobiologist. He recorded her weight loss, the way her wings drooped more each day, and the increasing tremor in her powerful legs. Everything pointed to severe malnutrition, but dragons were apex predators. They should be able to hunt and feed themselves. Easily, the mystery consumed his thoughts. During the day, while tending his livestock or working in his fields, Jake found himself staring toward the forest where Kalen disappeared after each visit. At night, he lay awake wondering what could reduce such a magnificent creature to begging for scraps from a human farmer. Lisa noticed his distraction during their daily video calls. "You're still thinking about that dragon, aren't you?" she asked one evening, her face concerned on the communication screen. "Her name is Kalen," Jake replied. "And yes, I can't stop thinking about her. Lisa, something is seriously wrong." "Dragons don't act like this." "Maybe you should contact the colonial authorities," Lisa suggested again. "They have xenobiologists who specialize in dragon behavior," but Jake shook his head. "She trusts me. If I bring in officials, she'd disappear forever. And I think she needs help more than she needs to be studied." The The next morning, Jake made a decision that would change everything. When Kaylin arrived for her usual portion of leftover meat, he was ready with more than just food. He had prepared his portable terrain scanner, a device that could track heat signatures through dense forest, and he had charged his personal communication device with enough power to last for days. Jake handed Kaylin the wrapped meat as usual, but this time he studied her more carefully. Her amber eyes seemed dimmer, and when she accepted the food, her massive claws trembled slightly. The tremor was so small that most people would have missed it, but Jake had been watching her for weeks. "Thank you, Jake Morrison," she said in her formal way. "Your generosity continues to honor your kind." Jake wanted to ask her directly what was wrong, but he knew her pride would never allow her to admit weakness to a human. Instead, he simply nodded and watched as she turned toward the forest. As soon as Kaylin disappeared into the trees, Jake grabbed his equipment and began following her trail. He stayed far enough behind to avoid detection, using the terrain scanner to track her heat signature through the dense undergrowth. His heart pounded as he realized he was about to break one of the most important rules of frontier life. Never follow a dragon into its territory. The trail led deeper into the forest than Jake had ever gone before. The trees grew thicker and taller, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating a green twilight that made every shadow seem threatening. Jake had to be careful not to make noise as he moved through the underbrush, following the faint heat signature on his scanner. After an hour of careful tracking, Jake realized they were heading toward the Ironwood Mountains. The massive peaks loomed ahead through the trees, their rocky faces covered in the dark, metal-like bark that gave them their name. This was territory marked as off-limits by the Galactic Council, designated as a dragon preserve where no other species was allowed to enter. Jake's hands started shaking as the reality of what he was doing hit him. He was following a dragon into protected dragon territory. If he was caught, he could face serious legal consequences. If he was caught by other dragons, he might not survive to face any consequences at all, but something about Kaylin's desperation drove him forward. The memory of her trembling claws and dimming eyes pushed him to keep following the heat signature on his scanner. Even as every instinct told him to turn back and return to the safety of his farm, the forest began to thin as they climbed higher into the mountains. The terrain scanner showed that Kaylin was moving steadily upward, following what appeared to be an old game trail that wound between the rocky outcroppings. Jake had to be even more careful now, as the lack of tree cover made it easier for her to spot him if she looked back. Finally, after 3 hours of climbing, the heat signature stopped moving. Jake crept forward carefully, using boulders and scraggly mountain trees for cover. What he saw ahead made him stop breathing for a moment. Kaylin had reached what appeared to be a natural cave system carved into the mountainside. The entrance was large enough for a dragon to enter comfortably, but it was partially hidden by fallen rocks and twisted mountain shrubs. Jake could see why it would be nearly impossible to spot from the air. He watched as Kaylin paused at the entrance, looking around carefully as if checking for threats. Then she called out in a language Jake didn't recognize, her voice echoing from the cave walls. The sounds were deep and melodious, completely different from the English she used when speaking to him. A response came from inside the cave. Another dragon voice, but weaker and more strained. Jake felt his heart racing as he realized there were more dragons in there. Kaylin wasn't alone. After a brief conversation in their own language, Kaylin entered the cave. Jake waited several minutes, then crept closer. He knew he was taking an enormous risk, but his scientific curiosity and genuine concern for Kaylin drove him forward. The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared from a distance. Jake could see that it opened into a much larger space beyond, though the interior was too dark to make out details. He activated the low-light function on his scanner and moved carefully toward the entrance. What he saw when he peered around the rocky opening would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cave wasn't a treasure hoard like the legends described. It wasn't filled with gold and precious gems. It was something far more shocking and heartbreaking. The cave was a makeshift hospital. Jake's breath caught as he took in the scene before him. Dozens of dragons lay scattered throughout the vast cavern, but these weren't the mighty beasts of legend. These were the sick, The wounded, the dying. Young dragons with infected wounds, elders whose scales had lost their luster, mothers whose wings bore the scars of desperate battles. Kaelin moved among them with practiced efficiency, distributing the pork Jake had given her. She tore the meat into careful portions, ensuring each dragon received exactly what they needed for their condition. The smallest portions went to the younglings, larger cuts to the wounded adults who needed protein to heal. Jake watched in amazement as Kaelin worked. Her movements were gentle and caring, completely different from the proud, distant creature he had been meeting at his fence line. Here, surrounded by her own kind, she showed a compassion that took his breath away. A young dragon, barely larger than a horse, lifted its head weakly as Kaelin approached. Its wing hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken and poorly healed. Kaelin fed it carefully, speaking in soft, reassuring tones in their own language. Near the back of the cave, an ancient dragon lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. His scales were so dull they looked almost gray, and Jake could see that he was dying. Kaelin saved a special portion of meat for him, something tender and easy to digest. Jake realized he was witnessing something no human had ever seen before. Dragons caring for their sick and wounded, showing the same compassion and love that any species would show for their own kind. These weren't the proud, invincible creatures the galaxy knew. These were refugees, survivors of some terrible disaster that had left them broken and dying. As Jake watched, trying to process what he was seeing, his foot slipped on a loose stone. The sound echoed through the cave like a gunshot. Every dragon head in the cavern turned toward him. Kellen's amber eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and terror as she saw him standing in the entrance. "Human!" she roared, her voice shaking the cave walls and causing small rocks to fall from the ceiling. "You dare invade our sanctuary? You have seen what no outsider must witness." Jake stood frozen as dozens of dragon eyes fixed on him. He knew he was about to die, but all he could think about was the young dragon with the broken wing and the ancient one lying so still in the back of the cave. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern rather than fear. The question seemed to drain the fight from Kaelin. Her massive shoulders sagged as she settled onto her haunches, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked completely defeated. Jake Morrison stood at the entrance of the cave, surrounded by dozens of sick and dying dragons, and felt his understanding of the universe shift completely. The question he had asked hung in the air like a challenge, and he could see the internal struggle playing out in Kellen's amber eyes. "What happened to you?" he repeated, stepping further into the cave despite the danger. His voice echoed off the rocky walls, and several of the younger dragons lifted their heads to look at him with curiosity rather than fear. Kellen's massive form trembled as she looked around at her dying clan. The proud mask she had worn during all their meetings finally cracked, and Jake saw the depth of her desperation and pain. "The Consortium," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have been mining our traditional territories, poisoning our hunting grounds with their industrial waste. Our food sources have dwindled, our young are born weak, our elders waste away." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The Terran Mining Consortium was a human-owned corporation that had been expanding throughout this sector for the past 5 years. They claimed to follow all environmental protocols, but Jake had heard whispers from other farmers about corners being cut and regulatory inspectors being bought off. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, moving closer to where Kaelin sat among her people. 2 years, she replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "We have hidden our weakness, maintained our reputation as fearsome predators, but in truth we are dying. Slowly, quietly, with what dignity we can preserve." Jake looked around the cave with new eyes. What he had first seen as a hospital was actually a place where an entire species was making its last stand. The young dragon with the broken wing caught his attention again. The creature's injury hadn't been caused by a hunting accident or territorial dispute. The bone had been shattered by something heavy and mechanical. "Mining equipment," Jake said, understanding flooding through him. "They're not just poisoning your food sources. They're destroying your nesting sites." Kalen nodded sadly. The consortium expands their operations every month. They blast through our ancient caves, the places where our ancestors have laid eggs for thousands of years. They dump their chemical waste into our streams. They strip mine the mountains where we have hunted for generations. An elderly dragon near the back of the cave raised his head with great effort. His scales were so dull they looked almost white, and his breathing was labored and painful. When he spoke, his voice was like wind through dry leaves. "Young human," he said in heavily accented English, "I am Elder Thane of the Crimson Ridge. Clan, I have lived for 800 years, and I have never seen such destruction. The metal hunters poison everything they touch." Jake approached the elder carefully, his scientific mind already working. "Elder Thane, may I examine you? I have some medical knowledge, and I might be able to help." The old dragon's eyes widened in surprise. A human who offers aid rather than demanding tribute? These are strange times indeed. Jake pulled out his medical scanner, a device he had brought from his research days. The readings it gave him were horrifying. Heavy metal poisoning, severe malnutrition, and organ damage consistent with long-term exposure to industrial chemicals. Every dragon in the cave showed similar symptoms. "This is mercury poisoning," Jake said, showing the scanner readings to Kalen, "and cadmium and at least 6 other heavy metals. Your entire clan has been slowly poisoned by mining runoff." A younger dragon, one of the few who still had some strength left, lifted her head angrily. "We know what kills us, human. The question is, what can be done about it? The consortium has legal permits from your government. They claim their operations are safe." Jake studied the young dragon's defiant expression. Despite her weakness, she still had fire in her eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. "I am Vera, daughter of Kalen," she replied. "I was to be the next guardian of our hunting grounds, but there are no hunting grounds left to guard." Jake felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it all. These magnificent creatures were dying because of human greed and negligence. The consortium was systematically destroying an entire ecosystem and covering it up with legal paperwork and bribed officials. "Why haven't you fought back?" Jake asked. "Dragons are powerful. You could stop the mining operations." Kellen's expression grew bitter. "And confirm every fear the galaxy has about us? We are already seen as dangerous monsters. If we attacked human installations, even in self-defense, we would be labeled as aggressors. The Galactic Council would authorize military action against us. So you chose to die quietly rather than fight," Jake said, understanding the impossible position they were in. "We chose to preserve our dignity," Elder Thane corrected. "Better to fade away with honor than to become the monsters your stories claim we are." Jake spent the next hour moving through the cave, using his medical scanner to assess each dragon's condition. The results were consistent and heartbreaking. The entire clan was dying from the same systematic poisoning, and they were too proud to ask for help from the very species that was killing them. A small dragon, barely larger than a dog, approached him cautiously. Her scales were a pale gold color, but they were dull and lifeless. She couldn't have been more than a few months old. "Are you here to help us?" she asked in a tiny voice that broke Jake's heart. "I'm going to try," Jake promised, kneeling down to her level. "What's your name, little one?" "I'm Pip," she said. "My mama says I'm sick because of the bad water, but she doesn't know I understand." Jake looked around the cave at all the dying dragons and felt something harden in his chest. These weren't monsters or legendary creatures. They were people with families and feelings and a right to live without being poisoned by corporate greed. "Kalen," he said, standing up with new determination, "I can help you, but you have to trust me completely. I need to document everything that's happening here. I need proof of what the consortium is doing." Kellen's amber eyes flashed with hope and fear. "What do you have in mind, Jake Morrison?" "I'm going to expose them," Jake said firmly. "I'm going to show the galaxy what's really happening here. But I need your permission to record everything, and I need you to trust me with your clan's safety." The cave fell silent as every dragon considered his words. Finally, Elder Thane spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 8 centuries of wisdom. Young human, if you can save even one of our younglings, you will have earned the eternal gratitude of dragonkind. But know this, if you betray our trust, if you use our suffering for your own gain, there will be nowhere in the galaxy you can hide from our vengeance. Jake met the elder's gaze steadily. I understand. I won't betray you, I promise. Kaylin stood up slowly, her massive form casting shadows across the cave walls. Then we place our fate in your hands, Jake Morrison. May your human compassion prove stronger than your human greed. As Jake began setting up his recording equipment, he realized he was about to do something that would change not just the fate of the Crimson Ridge clan, but the entire relationship between humans and dragons throughout the galaxy. The truth about what was happening in this cave would shake the foundations of interspecies relations and force everyone to confront the reality of what corporate greed could do to an entire species. Little Pip crawled closer to him, her tiny claws clicking on the stone floor. Will you really help us? She asked again. Jake reached out and gently touched her dull scales. I promise, Pip, I'm going to help you. He just hoped he was strong enough to keep that promise. Jake Morrison spent the next 3 days living in the Dragon Cave, and it changed him in ways he never expected. He had come seeking answers to Kellen's strange behavior, but he found himself becoming part of something much larger and more important than he had ever imagined. Every morning, Jake woke up surrounded by dragons who were slowly dying from human greed. He used his medical scanner to check on each patient, taking detailed notes about their conditions and tracking their symptoms. The data he collected painted a horrifying picture of systematic environmental destruction. Little Pip had become his constant companion, following him around the cave as he worked. Her tiny golden scales were growing brighter each day, thanks to the medicine Jake had been able to provide from his farm's veterinary supplies. She was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but she seemed to sense that Jake was trying to help. Jake, she said one morning, tugging at his pants leg with her small claws, will you teach me more human words? Mama says I should learn in case we need to talk to other humans like you. Jake's heart ached as he realized that even the youngest dragons were preparing for a future where they might need to beg humans for help. He knelt down to Pip's level and spent an hour teaching her simple English phrases, marveling at how quickly she learned. Elder Thane had taken to watching Jake work with curious interest. The ancient dragon's condition was the worst of all the clan members, but his mind remained sharp and wise. On the second day, he called Jake over to where he lay near the back of the cave. Young human, Thane said in his whisper-thin voice, I have been thinking about your plan to expose the metal hunters. You understand that this will put you in great danger? Jake nodded as he checked the elder's vital signs with his scanner. I know, but what's happening here is wrong, and someone needs to speak up for you. Why? Thane asked simply. We are not your people. We have never done anything to help humans. Why would you risk yourself for us? Jake paused in his work, considering the question. Because it's the right thing to do. Because you're suffering. And I have the power to help. That's enough reason for me. Thane's ancient eyes studied Jake's face for a long moment. You are very different from the other humans we have encountered, Jake Morrison. Most of your kind see us only as legends or threats. You see us as people. On the third day, Jake began implementing his plan. He had been collecting water samples from the streams that flowed through dragon territory, and the results from his portable analysis kit were damning. The water contained levels of mercury, cadmium, and other heavy metals that were dozens of times higher than what any living creature could safely consume. He also collected tissue samples from the dragons who were willing to let him, always with their full consent and understanding of what he was doing. The samples showed the same pattern of heavy metal poisoning that his scanner readings had indicated, but Jake knew that scientific evidence alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to do something that would capture the galaxy's attention in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up by corporate lawyers and bribed officials. Kaylin, he said as she returned from her daily flight to check for consortium activity in their territory. I need to ask you something that might sound crazy. Kaylin settled her massive form near where Jake was tending to a young dragon's infected wound. After everything that has happened, I doubt anything you say could sound crazy to me, Jake Morrison. I want to broadcast live footage from this cave to the Galactic News Network, Jake said. I want to show the entire galaxy what's really happening here. The cave fell silent. Every dragon who was awake turned to stare at Jake with expressions ranging from shock to horror. Vera, Callan's daughter, was the first to speak. You want to expose our weakness to the entire galaxy? She asked, her voice sharp with anger. You want to show everyone how pathetic we've become? No, Jake said firmly. I want to show everyone how strong you've been. I want them to see that. Dragons aren't invincible monsters, but people who deserve protection and respect. I want them to see what corporate greed can do to an entire species. Elder Thane raised his head with great effort. Explain this plan more fully, young human. Jake pulled out his communication device and showed them the recording functions. This device can broadcast live video to anywhere in the galaxy. If I can get a signal to the Galactic News Network during their primetime broadcast, billions of people will see what's happening here. And what makes you think they'll care? Vera asked bitterly. Humans have been destroying our world for 2 years. Why would showing them more destruction change anything? Because they don't know, Jake said. The consortium has been covering this up, bribing officials and hiding the evidence. Most humans have no idea what's being done in their name. If they saw this, if they saw you caring for your sick and dying, if they saw little Pip trying to learn English so she can beg for help, it would change everything. Kaylin was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, she spoke. This broadcast would destroy our reputation forever. The galaxy would know that dragons can be weak, that we can suffer and die like any other species. Yes, Jake agreed. But it would also show that you're capable of love and compassion and sacrifice for your families. It would show that you deserve to live. Little Pip wandered over to where they were talking, her bright eyes curious. What's a broadcast? She asked. Jake picked her up gently, amazed at how light she was despite her dragon heritage. It's a way to talk to lots and lots of people all at once, Pip, like telling a story to the whole galaxy. Will you tell them about how sick we are? She asked innocently. Yes, Jake said. And about how brave your mama and grandfather and everyone else has been, Pip nodded seriously. That's good. Maybe some of the people will want to help us. Her simple words hung in the air, and Jake could see the impact they had on the adult dragons. Here was their youngest member, still hopeful that the galaxy might contain beings willing to help rather than harm them. We need to vote, Kaylin said finally. This decision affects our entire clan. The voting process was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed. Each dragon, even the sickest ones, was given a chance to speak their mind about Jake's proposal. The debate was conducted in both their own language and in English, so Jake could understand. Some dragons were afraid that exposing their weakness would lead to attacks from other species who saw dragons as threats. Others worried that it would only bring more humans to their territory, making their situation worse. But slowly a consensus began to emerge. Elder Thane spoke last, his voice carrying the authority of his 8 centuries of life. I have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars. In all that time, I have learned one truth. Sometimes the greatest courage is in admitting that you need help. He turned his ancient eyes to Jake. Young human, if you believe this plan can save our younglings, then you have my blessing. But know that once this path is chosen, there will be no turning back. The galaxy will never see dragons the same way. Again, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was about to change the fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a dragon in a galaxy that had feared and respected them for millennia. I understand, Jake said, and I promise you I won't let you down. Little Pip snuggled closer to him, her warm scales pressing against his chest. Will you tell them that I'm learning English? She asked. I'll tell them everything, Pip, Jake promised. The whole galaxy is going to know your story. As Jake began setting up his broadcasting equipment, he realized he was about to attempt something that would either save the Crimson Ridge clan or destroy the last shreds of dragon dignity in the galaxy. But looking around at the sick and dying dragons who had placed their trust in him, he knew there was no other choice. The broadcast that would change everything was about to begin. Jake Morrison stood in his familiar barn, looking directly into the camera of his communication device as it began broadcasting live to the Galactic News Network. His hands were steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal to the galaxy. Behind him, the ordinary tools and equipment of his farm created a scene that billions of viewers would recognize as completely normal. "My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a farmer on New Haven Colony," he began, his voice calm and clear. 3 weeks ago, a dragon came to my farm asking for leftover pork. What I discovered when I followed her home will change everything you think. You know about dragons? The camera followed Jake as he walked away from his barn and into the forest that bordered his property. He had practiced this route several times, making sure he could lead viewers smoothly from his ordinary human world into the hidden reality of dragon suffering. "Dragons are not the invincible predators we believe them to be," Jake continued as he moved through the trees. "They are people with families and feelings and the capacity to suffer just like any other species in our galaxy." As Jake climbed higher into the mountains, he explained what he had learned about the Terran Mining Consortium's operations. He showed the polluted streams, pointing out the unnatural colors in the water and the dead fish floating on the surface. His portable scanner confirmed the presence of deadly chemicals that should never exist in a natural ecosystem. "This is what corporate greed looks like," Jake said, holding up a water sample that glowed with a sickly greenish tint. "This is what happens when profit matters more than life." The entrance to the dragon cave appeared ahead, and Jake paused before entering. "What you're about to see has never been witnessed by any human before. I'm showing you this with the full permission and trust of the Crimson Ridge Dragon Clan, because they believe the galaxy deserves to know the truth." Jake stepped into the cave, and the camera captured the scene that had shocked him just days before. Dozens of dragons lay scattered throughout the vast cavern, but these weren't the mighty beasts of legend. They were sick, wounded, and dying from systematic poisoning. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as Jake moved among the dragons, explaining their conditions and showing the test results that proved corporate contamination. He introduced viewers to Elder Thane, whose 800 years of wisdom couldn't protect him from human-made toxins. He showed them Vera, who should have been in her prime, but was wasting away from mercury poisoning. "These dragons have been dying quietly for 2 years," Jake explained as he knelt beside a young dragon with a shattered wing. "They've been too proud to ask for help from the very species that was killing them." But the moment that truly changed, everything came when little Pip approached Jake on camera. The tiny dragon had been watching from a safe distance, but her curiosity finally overcame her shyness. Her golden scales were brighter than they had been a week ago, thanks to Jake's treatment, but she was still obviously sick. "Hello," Pip said, in careful English, looking directly into the camera. "Are you the people Jake talks to?" Jake knelt down to her level, his expression gentle and encouraging. "Yes, Pip, these are people from all over the galaxy. Can you tell them your name?" "I'm Pip," she said proudly. "I'm learning human words so I can ask for help when I get bigger." Jake says that's okay to do. The simple innocence of her words hit the galaxy like a thunderbolt. Here was a dragon child, a member of the most feared and respected species in known space, learning human language so she could beg for help to survive. "Pip," Jake said softly, "can you tell everyone what happened to your wing?" Pip lifted her tiny wing, which bore fresh scars from a recent injury. "The big machines came and broke my flying place. Mama says they didn't mean to hurt me, but it still hurts a lot." Across the galaxy, billions of viewers watched this tiny dragon explain how human mining equipment had destroyed her nesting area and injured her in the process. The contrast between her obvious pain and her willingness to give humans the benefit of the doubt was heartbreaking. Elder Thane's ancient voice added weight to Pip's testimony. Young ones like Pip represent the future of dragonkind, he said, his words barely above a whisper but clearly audible on the broadcast. If we cannot save them, our species will fade into memory within a generation. Jake spent the next hour documenting everything he had learned. He showed viewers the careful way Kaylin distributed food among her clan, ensuring the sickest dragons received exactly what they needed. He demonstrated how the dragons cared for each other with tenderness. That contradicted every stereotype about their species. This is what dragons really are, Jake said as he watched Kaylin gently clean an infected wound on a younger dragon. They're not monsters or legends. They're families trying to survive in a world that's being destroyed around them. The broadcast reached its emotional peak when Jake asked Kaylin to speak directly to the galaxy. The massive Dragoness had been hesitant to appear on camera, but she finally agreed to share her perspective. "We are the Crimson Ridge clan," she said with as much dignity as she could muster despite her obvious weakness. "For 2,000 years we have lived in these mountains. We have never attacked human settlements. We have never stolen human treasure. We have lived quietly and peacefully, asking nothing from the galaxy except to be left alone." Her amber eyes seemed to look directly through the camera at every viewer. "But you have not left us alone. You have poisoned our world, destroyed our homes, and murdered our children with your machines and chemicals, yet we do not seek revenge. We seek only the right to live." The broadcast concluded with Jake making a direct appeal to viewers. The Terran Mining Consortium claims their operations are safe and legal. They have permits and paperwork that say they're following all environmental regulations. But you've seen the truth with your own eyes. You've heard it from the dragons themselves. He picked up little Pip, who had fallen asleep in his lap during the broadcast. "This is Pip. She's 3 months old, and she's dying from mercury poisoning because human corporations value profit more than life. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the broadcast ending, the Galactic News Network's communication systems were flooded with messages from outraged viewers. The revelation that dragons were not only capable of suffering but were actively being poisoned by human corporations sparked the largest interspecies rights movement in galactic history. Stock markets across human space opened the next morning to massive sell-offs of Terran Mining Consortium shares. The company's value dropped by 70% in the first hour of trading as investors fled from what was clearly about to become the biggest corporate scandal in galactic history. Government officials who had taken bribes from the consortium found their communication systems jammed with angry messages from constituents demanding explanations. Environmental protection agencies that had approved the mining permits were suddenly faced with investigations and calls for resignation, but the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed dragons themselves. Overnight, they went from being seen as untouchable apex predators to being recognized as a vulnerable species in desperate need of protection. The Galactic Council called an emergency session within 48 hours of Jake's broadcast. For the first time in galactic history, dragons were invited to speak directly to the assembled representatives of all known species. Kaylin, her strength restored by proper medical treatment that arrived within days of the broadcast, became the first dragon ambassador to address the Galactic Council. Her words were simple but powerful. "We do not ask for your pity. We ask for your justice." The emergency legislation that followed was unprecedented in its scope and speed. The Terran Mining Consortium was stripped of all its permits and faced criminal charges for environmental terrorism and attempted genocide. New laws were passed protecting not just dragon territories but the homeworlds of all sentient species from industrial exploitation. Jake Morrison continued to operate his small farm, but he also became the official liaison between human colonies and dragon clans throughout the galaxy. His simple act of kindness in sharing leftover pork had grown into a movement that changed the fundamental relationship between species. Little Pip grew strong and healthy under proper medical care. She never forgot the human farmer who had saved her clan, and she often visited Jake's farm to practice her English and share stories of her flying lessons. The leftover pork that had started it all became a symbol throughout the galaxy, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can reveal the deepest truths about who we are and who we can become. Jake's story proved that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology or its weapons, but its capacity for empathy in the face of suffering. Even when that suffering belonged to those who were once considered enemies, the galaxy was forever changed by one farmer's decision to follow a hungry dragon home, and the courage to show the universe that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from having the compassion to help those who cannot help themselves.